Section 1 of Black Experience in America, 18th to 20th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ex-Slave James Bolton by WPA, USA. Recording by Marianne Spiegel. Black Experience in America, 18th to 20th Century, by various authors. Section 1. Testimony from Slave Narratives, A Folk History of Slavery in the United States, from Interviews with Former Slaves, Volume 4. Georgia Narratives, Part 1, 1936 to 1938. By the Works Progress Administration. Ex-Slave Interview, James Bolton, Athens, Georgia. Written by Mrs. Sarah H. Hall, Federal Writers Project, Residency 4, Athens, Georgia. Edited by Miss Maud Berrigan, Residency 13, Augusta, Georgia. It never was the same on our plantation, atter we done laid Mistis away, said James Bolton, 85-year-old mulatto ex-slave. I ain't never forget what Mistis did. She had been so good to every nigger in our plantation. When we got sick, Mistis allus had us tended to. The niggers on our plantation all walked to church to hear her funeral sermon, and then walked to the graveyard to the buryin'. James, shriveled and wrinkled, with his bright eyes taking in everything on one of his rare visits to town, seemed glad of the chance to talk about slavery days. He spoke of his owner as my employer, and hastily corrected himself by saying, I means my marster. My employer, I means my marster, and my mistis, they was sure all right white folksies, he continued. They lived in a big 'ouse. Hit was all painted brown. I heard tell there was more 900 acres in our plantation, and lots of folkses lived on it. The biggest portion was woods. My pa, he was named Whitfield Bolton, and 'Liza Bolton was my ma. Charlie, Edmund, Thomas, and James Bolton was my brothers, and I had one sister. She was Rosa. We belonged to Marse Whitfield Bolton, and we lived on his plantation in Oglethorpe County, near Lexington, not far from the Wilkes County line. We stayed in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor. A frame made out'n pine poles was fastened to the wall to hold up the mattresses. Our mattresses was made out'n cotton bagging stuffed with wheat straw. Our kivers was quilts made out'n old clothes. Slave omens too old to work in the fields made the quilts. Ma, she went up to the big house onct a week to get the 'lowance or vittles. They 'lowanced us a week's rations at a time. Hit were generally hog meat, cornmeal, and sometimes a little flour. Ma, she done our cookin' on the coals in the fireplace at our cabin. We had plenty of possums and rabbits and fishes, and sometimes we had wild turkeys and partridges. Slaves warn't s'posen to go huntin' at night, and everybody know you can't catch no possums, 'ceptin' at night. Just the same, we had plenty of possums, and nobody acts how we cotch 'em. James laughed and nodded. Now, 'bout them rabbits. Slaves warn't 'lowed to have no guns and no dogs of they own. All the dogs on our plantation belonged to my employer, I means, to my marster, and he 'lowed us to use his dogs to run down the rabbits. Niggermens and boys 'ud go in crowds, sometimes as many as 12 at one time, and a rabbit ain't got no chance 'ginst a lot of niggers and dogs when they light out for to run 'em down. What wild critters we wanted to eat and couldn't run down, we was right smart 'bout ketchin' in traps. We cotched lot of wild turkeys and partridges in traps and nets. Long Crick run through our plantation, and the river warn't no fur piece off. We sho did catch the fishes, mostly cats, and perch and heaps of suckers. We cotch our fishes mosen generally with hook and line, But the carpenters on our plantation knowed how to make basket traps that sure enough did lay in the fishes. God only knows how long it's been since this old nigger pulled a big shad out of the river. Ain't no shads been cotch on the river round here in so long I disremembers when. We didn't have no gardens of our own round our cabins. My employer, I means my marster, had one big gyarden for the whole plantation, and all his niggers had to work in it whensomever he wanted 'em to. Then he give 'em all plenty good garden sass for thyselves. They was collards and cabbage and turnips and beets and English peas and beans and onions, and they was allus some garlic for ailments. Garlic was mostly to cure worms. They roasted garlic in the hot ashes and squeezed the juice out'n it, and made the chilluns take it. Sometimes they made poultices out'n garlic for the pneumony. We saved a heap of bark from wild cherry and poplar and black haw and slippery ellum trees, and we dried out mullein leaves. They was all mixed and brewed to make bitters. Whensomever a nigger got sick, them bitters was good for, well, ma'am, they was good for what ailed 'em. We tuck 'em for rheumatiz, for fever, and for the misery in the stomach, and for most all sorts of sickness. Red oak bark tea was good for sore throat. I never seed no store-bought clothes twel long atter freedom done come. One slave woman done all the weavin' in a separate room called the loom house. The cloth was dyed with homemade colorin'. They used indigo for blue, red oak bark for brown, green husks offen walnuts for black, and sumacs for red, and they'd mix these colors to make other colors. Other slave omens larned to sew, and they made all the clothes. Endurin' the summertime we just wore shirts and pants made out of plain cotton cloth. They wove wool in with the cotton to make cloth for our winter clothes. The wool was raised right thar on our plantation. We had our own shoemaker man. He was a slave named Buck Bolton, and he made all the shoes the niggers on our plantation wore. I weren't nothin' but chillun when freedom come. In slavery time, chilluns warn't 'lowed to do no wuck, 'cause'n the marsters wanted they niggers to grow up big and strong, and didn't want 'em stunted none. That's how come I didn't git no more beatin's than I did. My employer, I means my marster, never did give me but one lickin'. He had done told me to watch the cows and keep 'em in the pasture. I cotch lots of grasshoppers and started fishin' in the crick runnin' through the pasture, and fust thing I knowed, the overseer was roundin' up all the other niggers to get the cows out in the cornfields. I knowed then my time had done come. James was enjoying the spotlight now, and his audience did not have to prompt him. Plantation recollections crowded together in his old mind. We had one overseer at a time, he says, and he allus lived at the big 'ouse. The overseers weren't quality white folkses, like our marster and mistus, but we never heard nothin' 'bout poor white trash in them days, and effen we had heard somethin' like that, we'd ha' known better'n to let marster hear us make such talk. Marsters made us call his overseer Mister. We had one overseer named Mr. Andrew Smith, and another time we had an overseer named Mr. Pope Short. Overseers was just there on the business of gettin' the work done. They seed atter everybody doin' his wuck, 'cordin' to order. My employer, I means my marster, never 'lowed no overseer to whoop none of his niggers. Marster done all the whoopin' on the plantation hisself. He never did make no big bruises, and he never drawed no blood, but he sho' could burn 'em up with the lash. Niggers on our plantation was whupped for laziness mostly. Next to that, whuppings was for stealin' eggs and chickens. They fed us good, and plenty but a nigger's just bound to pick up chickens and eggs effen he kin, no matter how much he done eat. He just can't help it. Effen a nigger ain't busy he gwine to git into mischief. Now and then slaves would run away and go in the woods and dig dens and live in 'em. Sometimes they runned away on 'count of cruel treatment, but most of the time they runned away 'case'n they just didn't want to walk and wanted to laze around for a spell. The marsters allus put the dogs atter 'em and git 'em back. They had black and brown dogs called nigger hounds that weren't used for nothin' but to track down niggers. There warn't no such place as a jail whar we was. Ef a nigger done sompny disorderly, they jest nat'rally took a lash to him. I ain't never seed no nigger in chains twel long after freedom done come when I seed 'em in the chain gangs. The overseer woke us up at sunrise. Leas'n they call it sunrise. We would finish our vittles and be in the fields ready for work before we seed any sun. We laid off work at sunset and they didn't drive us hard. Leastwise, they didn't on our plantation. I done heard they was mouty hard on 'em on other plantations. My master never did 'low his niggers to work after sundown. My employer, I means my master, didn't have no bell. He had 'em blow bugles to wake up his hands and to call 'em from the fields. Sometimes the overseer blowed it. Mistis done larned the cook to count the clock, but none of the rest of our niggers could count the clock. I never knowed master to sell but one slave and he had just bought her from the market at New Orleans. She say it lonesome off on the plantation and asked master for to sell her to folkses livin' in town. Atter he done sold her, every time he got to town she beg him to buy her back, but he didn't pay her no more attention. When they had sales of slaves on the plantations, they let everybody know what time the sale gwine to be. When the crowd get together, they put the niggers on the block and sell 'em. Leastwise, they call it puttin' on the block. They just fotch 'em out and show 'em and sell 'em. There warn't no church for niggers on our plantation, and we went to white folks' church and listened to the white preachers. We set behind a partition. Sometimes on a plantation a nigger claim he done been called to preach, and effen he can git his master's consent, he can preach round under trees and in cabins when 'tain't work time. These nigger preachers in slavery times was called chairbackers. They warn't no chairbackers 'lowed to baptize none of marster's niggers. White preachers done our baptism in Long Crick. When we went to be baptized, they allus sang, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." The old negro's quavery voice rose in the familiar song. For a moment he sat thinking of those long ago Sundays. His eyes brightened again, and he went on. We never done no walk on Sundays on our plantation. The church was 'bout 9 miles from the plantation, and we all walked there. Anybody too old and feeble to walk the 9 miles just stayed home, 'case a master didn't 'low his mules used none on Sunday. All along the way, niggers from other plantations 'ud jine us, and sometimes before we get to the church house they'd be 40 or 50 slaves comin' along the road in a crowd. Preachin' generally lasted twel 'bout 3 o'clock. In summertime we had dinner on the ground at the church. Howsomever we didn't have no barbecue like they does now. Everybody cooked enough on Saturday and fotched it in baskets. I was 30 years old when I jined the church. Nobody ought to jine no church, twelst he is truly born to God, and effen he is truly born to God, he gwine know it. Effen you want a restin' place atter you leaves this old world, you ought to git ready for it now. When folkses on our plantation died, Marster allus let many of us as wanted to go lay offen wuck twel atter the buryin'. Sometimes it were 2 or 3 months atter the buryin' before the funeral sermon was preached. Right now, I can't recollect no song we sung at funerals 'cep'n "Hark from the tombs a doleful sound." The reedy old voice carried the funeral hymn for a few minutes and then trailed off. James was thinking back into the past again. Spring plowin' and hoein' times we worked all day Saturdays, but most'n generally we laid off work at 12 o'clock Saturday. That was dinner time. Saturday nights we played and danced, sometimes in the cabins, sometimes in the yards. Effen we didn't have a big stack of fat kindling wood lit up to dance by, sometimes the mens and omens would carry torches of kindling wood whilst they danced, and it sho' was a sight to see. We danced the turkey trot and buzzard lope, and how we did love to dance the Mary Jane. We would git in a ring, and when the music started, we would begin walkin' our footses while we sang, "You steal my true love and I steal yourn." Atter supper we used to gather round and knock tin buckets and pans. We beat 'em like drums. Some used they fingers and some used sticks for to make the drums sounds, and somebody allus blowed on quills. Quills was a roll of whistles made out'n reeds, or sometimes they made 'em out'n bark. Every whistle in the row was a different tone, and you could play any kind of tune you wants, effen you had a good row of quills. They sure did sound sweet. 'Bout the most fun we had was at corn shuckin's, whar they put the corn in long piles and called in the folkses from the plantation nigh round to shuck it. Sometimes 400 or 500 head of niggers would be shuckin' corn at one time. When the corn all done been shucked, they'd drink the liquor the marsters gave 'em, and then frolic and dance from sundown to sunup. We started shuckin' corn 'bout dinner time and tried to finish by sundown so we could have the whole night for frolic. Some years we'd go to 10 or 12 corn shuckin's in one year. We would sing and pray Easter Sunday, and on Easter Monday we frolicked and danced all day long. Christmas we allus had plenty good somethin' to eat, and we all got together and had lots of fun. We runned up to the big 'ouse early Christmas morning and holler out, "Mornin', Christmas gif'." Then they'd give us plenty of Sandy Claus, and we would go back to our cabins to have fun twel New Year's Day. We knowed Christmas was over and gone when New Year's Day came, kazen we got back to wuck that day atter frolickin' all Christmas week. We didn't know nuttin' 'bout games to play. We played with the white folkses' chilluns and watched atter 'em, but most of the time we played in the crick that runned up through the pasture. Nigger chilluns was allus skeered to go into the woods atter dark. Folkses done told us Rawhead and Bloody Bones lived in the woods, and git little chilluns and eat 'em up effen they go out in the woods atter dark. "Rock-a-bye Baby in the Tree Tops" was the only song I heard my ma sing to git her babies to sleep. Slave folkses sung most all the time, but we didn't think of what we sang much. We just got happy and started singin'. Sometimes we'd sing effen we felt sad and low down, but soon as we could, we'd go off where we could go to sleep and forget all 'bout trouble. James nodded his gray head with a wise look in his bright eyes. "When you hear a nigger singin' sad songs, hit's just kazen he can't stop what he is doin' long enough to go to sleep." The laughter that greeted this sally brought an answering grin to the wrinkled old face. Asked about marriage customs, James said, "Folkses didn't make no big to do over weddings like they do now. When slaves got married, they just laid down the broom on the floor and the couple jined hands and jumped back'ards over the broomstick. I done seen 'em married that way many a time. Sometimes my marster would fetch mistus down to the slave quarters to see a weddin'. Effen the slaves gettin' married was house servants. Sometimes they married on the back porch or in the back yard at the big house. But plantation niggers what was field hands married in they own cabins. The bride and groom just wore plain clothes kazen they didn't have no more. When the young marsters and mistesses at the big house got married, they 'lowed the slaves to gather on the porch and peep through the windows at the weddin'. Mos' and generally they'd give the young couple a slave or two to take with 'em to they new home. My marster's chilluns was too young to git married befo' the war was over. There was 7 of them chilluns. 4 of 'em was gals. What sort of tales did they tell 'mongst the slaves 'bout the Norf befo' the war? To tell the truth, they didn't talk much like they does now 'bout them sort of things. None of our niggers ever runned away, and we didn't know nothin' 'bout no North twel long atter freedom come. We visited round each other's cabins at night. I did hear tell 'bout the patterollers. Folkses say effen they cotched niggers out at night they'd give 'em what Paddy gave the drum. Just before freedom come 'bout 50 Yankee sojers come through our plantation and told us that the bullwhips and cowhides was all dead and buried. Them sojers just passed on in a hurry and didn't stop for a meal or vittles or nuffin'. We didn't talk much 'bout Mr. Abraham Lincoln endurin' slavery time, kazen we were skeered of him after the war got started. I don't know nothin' 'bout Mr. Jefferson Davis. I don't remember ever hearin' 'bout him. I has heard about Mr. Booker Washington, and they do say he runned a moughty good school for niggers. One morning Master blowed the bugle his own self and called us all up to the big house yard. He told us, "You all just as free as I is. You are free from under the taskmarster, but you ain't free from labor. You gotter labor and work hard effen you aims to live and eat and have clothes to wear. You can stay here and work for me, or you can go wheresoever you please. He said he'd pay us what was right, and lady, hit's the truth. They don't nary a nigger on our plantation leave our marster then. I worked on with marster for 40 years out of the war." James had no fear of Ku Klux. Right soon out of the war we saw plenty of Ku Kluxers, but they never bothered nobody on our plantation. They allus seemed to be having heaps of fun. Course, they did have to straighten out some of them brash young nigger bucks on some of the other farms round about. Most of the niggers the Ku Kluxers got atter was on no farm, but was just roaming round talking too much and making trouble. They had to take 'em in hand 2 or 3 times before some of them fool-free niggers could be larned to behave thyselves. But them Ku Kluxers kep' on atter 'em, twilst they larned they just got to be good effen they 'spect to stay around here. Hit was about 40 years out of the war before many niggers 'gun to own their own land. They didn't know nothin' 'bout tendin' to money business when the war done ended, and it take 'em a long time to larn how to buy and sell and take care of what they makes. James shook his head sadly. "Ma'am, heaps of niggers ain't ne'er learned nothin' 'bout them things yit." A long time after the war I married Lizzie Yerby. I didn't give Liza no chancet for to dress up. Just went and took her right outer the white folks' kitchen and married her at the church in her working clothes. We had 13 chilluns, but they ain't but 2 of 'em livin' now. Most our chilluns died babies. And durin' slavery Mistis took care of all the nigger babies born on our plantation and looked atter their mamies too, but atter freedom come, heap of nigger babies died out. James said he had 2 wives, both widows. I married my second wife 37 years ago. To tell the truth, I don't rightly know how many grandchildren I got, kazen I ain't seen some of 'em for 30 years. My chilluns is off from here, and I wouldn't know to save my life whar they is or what they does. My sister and brothers, they is done dead out what ain't gone off. I don't know for sure whar none of 'em is now." A sigh punctuated James's monologue, and his old face was shadowed by a look of fear. "Now I gwine tell you the truth. Now that it's all over, I don't find life so good in my old age as it was in slavery time when I was chillin' down on the marster's plantation. Then I didn't have to worry 'bout whar my clothes and my somethin' to eat was comin' from or whar I was gwine to sleep. Marster took keer of all that. Now I ain't able for to work and make a livin', and it's sure mighty hard on this old nigger." End of section 1.